Thank you for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming here. As I look at this program, one of the things that's most impressive to me is this page that shows the logos of all of the organizations that have taken part in this event. And to me, this is an extraordinarily impressive thing, showing a large number of groups, all of whom have somewhat different constituencies and somewhat different interests in Iranian-American cultural heritage, all pulling together in the same cause. And as you'll hear from the remarks I'm about to give, in a certain way, that combination mirrors what I think is one of the most profound realities of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Can you hear me if I speak at this level? Is this okay? One of our guests this evening, and as I was conversing earlier, said, well, Iranians, we're one nation, but many languages and many groups. And she might not have recognized it, but I found that an absolutely thrilling remark, because what she was also describing was the Achaemenid Persian Empire in terms that I want to talk to you about now. I want to give you a short introduction to some of the languages of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire of Cyrus, of Darius, and their successors. And I'm going to concentrate on the languages in which the Achaemenid Persian kings wrote their royal inscriptions and displayed the inscriptions that commemorated the kings, their reigns, and their deeds. But I have another agenda. Let me go back here, if I may. Kings are a very thin layer of society. They're the top layer, of course, but there's a lot beneath them. It's a surface over a much more complex society. And their inscriptions are likewise only the surface layer of a complex written record. And the reason I want to talk a little bit about the royal inscriptions, the inscriptions of kings now, is so that later I can tell you a little bit more about other documents in some of the same languages that come from deeper layers of the society that surrounded the court of the Achaemenid kings. Of course, by that I mean the Persepolis fortification texts. So let's begin at Persepolis. Early European visitors saw the ruined palaces of Persepolis pretty much as the troops of Alexander the Great had left them. But one of the things they saw there, is this going to work? Come on, there we go. One of the things they saw there on the exposed monuments of Persepolis were what seemed to be inscriptions in unknown writing, unknown at the time, using characters that were composed of little wedge-shaped elements, hence the name cuneiform. And often, as here, the inscriptions were in three parts, and the characters of the writing in each part were a little bit different. The short texts from these buildings at Persepolis were the basis. Having a little trouble getting through there. Thanks. Were the basis for the first steps in the partial decipherment of one of the kinds of writing, specifically the Old Persian writing, and it was done by this man, Georg Grotefend, a teacher in Göttingen in the very first years of the 19th century. Grotefend was able to identify correctly about 1/3 of the 42 Old Persian signs, and in doing so, he was able to confirm what people guessed, that the monuments at Persepolis belonged to Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes and the kings of the Achaemenid dynasty, whose names and histories they knew, but they knew not from their own words, but because they had been handed down by Greek and Roman writers. Is that going to work? Can I have the next? Other way. Thank you. The great monument of Darius the Great on the cliff face at Bisatun was the basis for finishing the main decipherment that took place between the 1840s and the 1860s, and that confirmed what other people had guessed, that the inscriptions were in three different languages written in two different scripts. One language was the language of the empire's rulers, the one we now call Old Persian. The other two were languages that originated with the empire's subjects. One was Elamite, that had been written and spoken in southwestern Iran long before speakers of Iranian languages arrived there, and the other was Akkadian, the ancient language of Babylonia and Assyria. The Old Persian used a script of its own. The Akkadian and the Elamite used different, more complex systems, but two different forms of the same thing. Now these trilingual inscriptions, the mere fact that they are inscriptions in three languages, were in themselves emblems of the Achaemenid Empire's immensity and complexity. And they, the inscriptions themselves, sometimes express this property of size and complexity with an Old Persian adjective. The adjective is wisbazana. It means literally having all kinds of people. And this is why I found it so thrilling to hear the modern Iranian nation described that way, because this term, wisbazana, is a term of great ideological significance to the Old Persians, and I hope to elaborate on that. But the Akkadian version could not translate that term. There is no way you can say that unambiguously in Akkadian. So they translated it with a different phrase. The phrase literally means people of all languages. So then as now, they thought of language as a marker of identity, but not the only marker. This portrayal of the Achaemenid Empire, of consisting of all kinds of people, appears again and again in the records of Achaemenid history, ranging from the reliefs of tribute bearers on the Apadana at Persepolis in their characteristic costume, bringing the characteristic product, all the way to the sculptures on the palaces and tombs, and for that matter, Herodotus's description of the exotic contingents in the armies of Xerxes. But this representation of the empire as multifaceted and multi-faced, this was not a given. The subjects of earlier empires, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, and others, had also spoken and written many languages. But when it came to putting inscriptions in the palaces of the rulers, the inscriptions were in the languages of the rulers, and the identity of the empire was expressed entirely in the terms of the rulers. The Achaemenids departed dramatically from these imperial precedents. The languages of their inscriptions were unprecedented symbols of relationships between rulers and ruled, and between the deep past of the ancient world and the Achaemenid present that incorporated that past. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. So let's start with the languages themselves. Could I have the next? First, Old Persian. Persian is, of course, the language of the rulers. It belongs to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family tree, as I'm sure most of you know, and much of the common vocabulary of Old Persian is easily recognizable not only from modern Persian, but from many modern European languages. The grammatical forms of Old Persian, noun endings, verb tenses, and moods, and so on, are relatively few and relatively simple in comparison to Avestan or to Sanskrit or even to classical Greek. But to a speaker of Akkadian, for example, or Elamite, Old Persian would have seemed a very different, very alien language. On the other hand, to a speaker of ancient classical Greek, the similarities would have been obvious and must have made Persian easy to grasp. So when it comes to talking to each other, Babylonians and Persians probably had a harder time, of all things, than Greeks and Persians. And when Themistocles, have the next please, Themistocles, the commander of the Athenian defense against the armies of Xerxes, was driven into exile by the very people he had defended, and was on his way to the court of the Persian king to see what kind of deal he could get there. He needed only 1 year of Persian language study before he felt ready to plead his case to the Achaemenid Persian king. Now, Persian was not the only Iranian language of ancient Iran, and it was not even the most common one. As speakers of Iranian languages moved into Western territories of what became Iran, sometime before 1000 BC, they spread out, they settled among indigenous people with distinct languages, and they developed distinct Iranian dialects. Inscriptions of the Assyrians who encountered these people called almost all of the Western Iranians Medes. The Persians proper were a much smaller group, beyond the reach of Iranian power and almost beyond, Assyrian power and almost beyond the reach of Assyrian knowledge. They settled in what would become Persia proper, more or less modern Fars, and they developed a distinct dialect. So even among the Iranian population of the Achaemenid Empire, Persian was an exception. It was the language of a ruling minority. And even in the heart of the Persian Empire, at Persepolis, the Old Persian of the royal inscriptions contained a reflection of this, many non-Persian dialect forms. For example, the word that I cited. The adjective wisbazana, meaning of all kinds of people, is a non-Persian dialect form. A Persian would have pronounced it wisadana. And in fact, we have that form. Do we have it in Old Persian? No, we have it transcribed in Elamite. One of the other languages of the empire records in Persia how a Persian would have said a word that the kings pronounced as if it were in a different dialect. Am I beginning to get complex enough for you? Is this at all like the realities of language in, say, modern California or modern Tehran? It should be, because people who lived 2,000 years ago were men and women like the rest of us, right? And they had short lives and anxieties and hopes and fears, and they were able to deal in many languages without difficulty. So this is something that the doublets of this kind, wisadana, wispadana, make plain in the Iranian inscriptions. What we would have guessed anyway, that at the court of the Iranian kings, where Iranians from all over Iran were present, of course there were many Iranian dialects and possibly distinct languages spoken there. So as inscriptions of Darius I put it, he and his family were not merely Persians of Persian descent, but they were also Iranians of Iranian stock. And in the Bisitun inscription, when he describes his new writing of the Old Persian language, he does not call it Persian, but he calls it Aryan, meaning Iranian. Can I have the next, please? Now, Old Persian script was used only for Old Persian language, and especially for the king's inscriptions, or else to identify objects or people connected with the king. And it is only recently, and only thanks to the Persepolis Fortification Archive project, that we now know that Old Persian could be, and occasionally was, used occasionally for ordinary, practical, mundane, everyday recording. And this is so far the first, and so far the only, ordinary, everyday text written in Old Persian script and Old Persian language. But it's enough to prove that when they wanted to, they could do it. But they didn't do it very much. May I have the next, please? Because for most of the ordinary recording of mundane matters at Persepolis, at least, they used Elamite. Elamite is completely unrelated to Old Persian and completely unrelated to Akkadian, and you will get a lot of disagreement about whether it's related to anything in a demonstrable way. It's a linguistic isolate of a kind that we find some of in the ancient Near East. Could I have the next? By the time of the Achaemenids, Elamite was already an ancient language. It had been written at least as early as 2200 BC in parts of modern Khuzestan and modern Fars, and it was probably spoken there and in surrounding areas for centuries before it was first reduced to writing. The next, please. Elamite had been the primary language of a whole succession of ancient kingdoms in territories of western Iran that had often been powerful enemies of Babylonian and Assyrian states, sometimes powerful allies of one or the other of those states. And these Elamite kingdoms had two heartlands. Facing Mesopotamia, roughly in the area of modern Khuzestan, was the area around Shush, Susa, ancient Susa, near, not too far from modern Ahwaz, roughly there. And Darius, as you know, built a palace at Susa, and that palace at Susa is the site for almost all of the Greek stories about the Persian court, and for that matter, the biblical book of Esther. From the point of view of Greek historians and the Bible, almost all of Persian history takes place at the court in Susa, not in Persepolis. But the second center, facing the interior high country of Iran, roughly in the area of modern Fars, There was an ancient city called Anshan. It's about 25 miles from modern Shiraz. That was the second center of these old Elamite states. And so when Iranian speakers spread out over western Iran, some of them came into these Elamite, historically, politically, linguistically Elamite territories. And in Anshan, they became the dominant population. So Elamite Anshan became Fars, became Parsa, became the kingdom of the Persians, and therefore, when Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, described his ancestry in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, he called himself and his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather kings of Anshan. This was just one reason for the use of Elamite as the second language of the Achaemenid inscriptions, just as Old Persian, with its dialect forms and its archaisms, expressed ties to a larger Iranian world and a deeper Iranian past. Elamite expressed a tie to a still deeper past of the territory that had become the Persian homeland. Now, at Susa and at Anshan, written Elamite had been a vehicle for a whole gamut of ancient literacy, for incantations, for works of scholarship, but especially for administrative records, and the Achaemenids continued to use Elamite as a written language of administration. So when the Iranians who operated the Achaemenid state recorded day-to-day management of the great king's assets in the very heart of Persia, they composed the records of that management as people had been doing for centuries in the language of the place, in Elamite. Elamite was and remained the language of practical literacy in Iran. Elamite was, in effect, how Iranians communicated in writing. The next, please. The third language of the trilingual inscriptions is a Babylonian dialect of Akkadian. It's a Semitic language distantly related to Hebrew and Arabic and others. And Akkadian texts had been written in Mesopotamia as early as about 2500 BC, and they continued to be written there at least as late as 75 AD, and possibly a generation or two after that. An extraordinarily long run when you think of it. Akkadian had once been the foremost written language of Western Asia, the area from the Zagros to the Mediterranean, used not only for diplomatic exchange and for commerce and for diplomacy, but also to teach and preserve works of literature, works of religion, works of science. And it was used in that way not only in Babylonia and Assyria, but at times also in Syria and Palestine, in Anatolia, briefly in Egypt, and yes, also in Elam. The next, please. By the time of the Achaemenids, though, Akkadian was in retreat and perhaps already in eclipse as a spoken language, but it was flourishing as a written language in Babylonia. Babylonian scribes used a contemporary dialect for letters and contracts, but the scholars used a literary dialect to transmit poetic, religious, philological, scientific, lexical, grammatical, historical texts, the whole great body of Mesopotamian learning that had been accumulated over thousands of years already. And in addition to that, they also used Akkadian to write down newly developing branches of learning, including mathematical astronomy and horoscopic astrology, things that were only beginning to flourish in Babylonia in the time of Persian rule. But the Akkadian in the inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes is not quite the language of Mesopotamian literature and scholarship. It has peculiarities of syntax, of vocabulary, of style, of word order. This isn't really the language of Mesopotamia. It's the Akkadian of Western Iran. I am trying to suggest to you that Akkadian was also a language of Iran in Achaemenid times. So when these Iranian speakers spread out into Western Iran, they were also in contact with people who spoke and wrote Akkadian in the western reaches of it. And what we're seeing in their royal inscriptions is this dialect, where they overlapped or struggled or coexisted in modern Khuzestan, in Luristan, in the central Zagros valleys and similar areas on the western fringe of what is now Iran. Could I have the next, please? Conspicuously missing from the monumental inscriptions is Aramaic, even though Aramaic was the premier language of official communication between Achaemenid provinces. It's a northwest Semitic language spoken in Syria and northern Mesopotamia at least since the end of the second millennium BC, and written from about 950 BC, maybe somewhat earlier, in a nice alphabet of about 22 characters. Written Aramaic had become a lingua franca in the earlier empires, and under the Achaemenids, its use spread dramatically to the remotest corners of the empire, all the way from southern Egypt to Central Asia, what's now Afghanistan, all in a pretty consistent dialect. So Aramaic in the Achaemenid Empire was some people's first language, and it was many people's second written language. The only known Aramaic version of an Achaemenid royal inscription is a fragmentary translation of the great text of Darius's monument on the cliff at Bisitun in Media. But at the end, the Aramaic version actually departs from the Bisitun text by adding a version of a part of another inscription, part of the eulogy on Darius's tomb at Nakhsur-Rostam, not far from Persepolis. Now, the manuscript of this Aramaic Bisitun, can I go back a bit? Came from a fortress at the very edge of the empire, from the island of Elefatini in southern Egypt. It's at today Aswan. And the manuscript was written about 100 years after the reign of Darius I, and it's written in 2 or 3 different hands, which means that it was being copied out by scribes as an advanced exercise. Now, toward the end of the great Persian and Elamite versions of the Bisitun text, Darius says that he had versions of this text sent out to all the lands. Could I have the next, please? And in fact, we have fragments of a couple of Akkadian versions that were found in Babylon, and we also have this Aramaic version found from Egypt to show that it was not only passed out in space among all the lands, as Darius says, but also passed down in time. It was a piece of scribal training, and training not only in the techniques of Aramaic writing and composition, but also in the expression of Achaemenid political and cultural identity. What do we do in schools? In schools, we ask students to read things like the Gettysburg Address or the Declaration of Independence, or for that matter, Tom Sawyer or Shakespeare or Aeschylus, possibly even Hafez. We're teaching them not just to read and write, but we're also teaching them how we want them to see their society, their culture, and their political environment. That's what ancient scribal schools did as well. So in this Aramaic fragments, we have a glimpse of scribes on the farthest edge of the empire, learning how the founder of the empire wanted himself and his empire to be understood. But in order to learn that, they did not have to do it in the language of the ruler. Not so easy a concept nowadays. If we teach Shakespeare, we're a little hesitant to teach it in languages other than English or perhaps German. So when Themistocles took the trouble to spend a year learning Persian before he traveled to the Achaemenid court, his effort may have been extremely courteous, but it was probably misplaced. It's quite likely that by thinking he would be more persuasive in Persian than in Greek, he may have been projecting a narrow Greek idea of the relationship between language and identity onto people who had already developed a much broader, much more inclusive idea of the relationship between language and identity. I have the next, please. In the time that remains, I'd like to give you a quick look at 3 of the most remarkable of the Achaemenid royal inscriptions. The Cyrus cylinder that came from Babylonia, the Bisitun inscriptions from the cliff on the road between Hamadan and Kermanshah, and the foundation inscriptions from the edge of the Taht at Persepolis. When Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BC, the world was old. More significant, the world knew its antiquity. Those are the 2 opening sentences of a history of the Persian Empire that was written by the Chicago historian Albert Olmsted and edited and published posthumously in 1948 by his student and my teacher, George Cameron. So from Cyrus to Olmsted to Cameron to me and now to you. The best emblem of Cyrus's own awareness of the antiquity, the ancient history of the world that he was acquiring control of is this barrel-shaped clay object, not really a cylinder, with 45 lines of Babylonian text, which we call today the Cyrus cylinder. For many centuries, when Babylonian and Assyrian kings built or rebuilt temples or palaces or other public works, they put inscriptions in the foundations, sometimes on objects of this kind of shape. The inscriptions told who they were and what they had done, sometimes just how they built the buildings, sometimes more about their wars, their conquests, their cultural achievements. And often, at the ends of those inscriptions, they appealed to later rulers, later people who might find these objects to treat them with respect, to put them back where they came from, and in fact, they sometimes mention finding and redepositing the inscriptions of older rulers. And this was part of how they, the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia, learned and lived with and attached themselves to their own antiquity. And in a general way, that's also what the Cyrus cylinder does. It follows this pattern. It came from the foundations of the main temple of the god Marduk in Babylon. It tells who Cyrus was. It tells some of what he did, specifically seen from the perspective of Babylon. And at the end, it even mentions finding an inscription of Assurbanipal, the Assyrian king who had ruled the Assyrian Empire at its greatest extent about 100 years before Cyrus's time. Cyrus was specifically acknowledging the political antiquity and the political precedence of Babylonia and Assyria in this document. And it conveys all of this with really somewhat interesting, not quite surprising, but genuinely interesting literary art and political sensitivity. What you have here is a rollout photograph of the entire inscription. And if you look closely, you can see this blank space here. That's the beginning. We have at least, despite all this damage, we have everything from the beginning all the way down here. This is a fragment that got separated by the antiquities trade and was only recognized in the 70s and rejoined to it, so it's not on the older copies. And then it goes all the way down here, and you can see the blank space here, and that line is the same as that line up there. So there's nothing really missing. Part of it is broken. The damage beginning describes bad days in Babylon, right? An incompetent and blasphemous ruler. Here, let me go on. This is a copy that's a modern copy done by Abdul-Majid Arfai based on that photograph. It's essentially a tracing from the photograph. I find it a little bit difficult to read, so I'm going to go on to the older version. This is the first publication of it. It was published in 1879. It's barely 5 years after the thing was discovered, and people had already pretty much figured out what it was and what it was about and made a big deal of it. But it starts out by saying up here in this area what terrible times are going on in Babylonia. It says here, Matu ana enutu ishakana inamatishu. That is, an incompetent, a weakling had been raised to lordship over his land. Where are we? Line 8. It says, tapshuchti. Wait a minute. Where am I here? Yeah, it's over here at this end. Nishishu ina apshani la tapshuchti. It says uhalik kulasin. He, the king of Babylon, was destroying his own people with unremitting labor. And it goes on to say how the Babylonian god Marduk was infuriated. He left, he searched the world for a just ruler, and he found Cyrus. Right down here, it's, where are we? Pardon me, I'm going to have to step away and look a little more closely. Bingo. Here it says the Ishtema, he searched all the lands. Malki Isharu, a just king, Bibil Libishu, his heart's desire. Kurash, king of what? King of the city of Anshan. King of Anshan. He doesn't even call him king of Persia, right? And he says he took him by the hand and he brought him into Babylon. He ordered him to come to Babylon. He led him into Babylon without battle, without conflict. And the people of Babylon, all of them, he bowed down before him. He, Cyrus, bowed down before him. He, Marduk, bowed down before him, Cyrus. And they kissed his feet, and their faces lit up. Everybody became happy. Now look at what happens. The composer of this text is using a lot of very familiar phrases from older Babylonian and Assyrian royal inscriptions, but he's doing it with rhetorical skill. The text begins at ground level. Troubled times in Babylon, everybody's having a hard time. They're made to work constantly. They're, it says, grumbling, right? And the God is hearing them. And then it goes to the perspective of not just the omniscient third-person narrator, but the actual God, Marduk, who leaves Babylon. Suddenly are seeing it from the heavenly perspective of Marduk. He's searching all the lands everywhere. He spots Cyrus. We zoom in on Cyrus, and he's taking him by the hand and bringing him into Babylon, and you close the circle. And just at that point, the text switches from third person to first person. He says here, Anaku, Kurash, and he starts to give all of his titles. I think that's quite a nice little bit of work. Instead of Cyrus beginning saying, I am Cyrus, I am the great king, I am the great conqueror, it begins with the world organized in such a way that Cyrus comes to Babylon, and then he can begin to speak with his own voice. And he makes it clear right away that he's here to stay. He says down here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to read the Akkadian to you, but he says that Marduk gave his gracious blessings to me, Cyrus, the king who reveres him, Marduk, and to Cambyses, my son, my own offspring. He's naming not only himself as king, but he's already designated his successor. He's not just passing through, he's going to stay there. And we know from other texts that this is a reference to very specific political circumstances at the time, because we have other texts that tell us that in the first year after Cyrus occupied Babylon, his son Cambyses held the title King of Babylon, while Cyrus held the title King of all the lands. And what's more, he controlled assets, property, and personnel that had previously been controlled by the crown prince of the last Babylonian king. So that means Cyrus and his son are not only there to stay, but they're slotting themselves into a political and institutional structure that they were completely aware of and ready to put to use. And then it goes on to say, in these lines down here, that he appointed governors everywhere, and then kings of all the lands, and especially kings of the west country, Amuri, the western country, brought their heavy tribute to him, bowed down before him, and kissed his feet. And that's an absolutely specific reference to the previous conquest state of the Babylonian Empire. So Cyrus is portraying himself here, not only as occupying the Babylonian throne, establishing a dynasty in Babylonia, but actually restoring the Babylonian Empire. And if a contemporary Babylonian were to hear only what Cyrus says in this text, he could be allowed to believe, prepared to believe, that what Cyrus was doing was restoring a Babylonian empire that had fallen into trouble, and that Babylon was about to become the new capital of an empire, a tributary empire, ruled from Babylon by Cyrus and his descendants. Now in 539 BC, or soon after, when this text was written, it might have been just barely possible to subscribe to that view of things, a stable restoration of the Babylonian Empire ruled by Cyrus of Anshan. But we know from our perspective that taking over Babylonia was only a step in a far-reaching and long-lasting series of changes, not only for Babylonian society, but for its Persian rulers. Cyrus and his successors not only took over the Babylonian Empire, but transformed Babylonia into just one of several political and economic and cultural centers of a much, much larger and more durable empire, an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus and lasted for about 200 years. And that's not a small thing, because it was an achievement in scale and an achievement in time that was unmatched until the Roman Empire, and had never happened before in the ancient Near East. This monument is certainly the best record of the biggest early step in that development. This is the combination of a relief sculpture and a series of inscriptions that Darius I put on the cliff face at Bisitun, above the road between Babylonia and Ecbatana, Babylonia and Media, between 520 and 518 BC. We know exactly when it was done because of the way in which the monument commemorates Darius's rise to power. The relief, as you see, shows him standing in triumph before his defeated adversaries, and the main text, written in 3 languages, describes his ancestry, describes his accession, narrates the defeat of his opponents in Babylonia and Elam and in various parts of Iran, and it exhorts future rulers to believe this account, protect this monument, and make it known to everybody. And we even have captions attached to these figures to make sure that we know which one of these guys is which one, so the picture is connected to the text. I love this thing. This is one of the greatest texts and monuments anywhere, and I could go on about it for hours, but you're already wearing out, and I'm not going to, so I'm going to confine myself to 3 observations about it. To begin with, if you read the text, and if you believe the text, which Darius tells you you should do, then you know that the scene in this relief never happened. The text says perfectly clearly that each one of these guys was defeated and executed at a different time and place. And they tell you exactly where and exactly when. And no 2 of them ever saw each other. This scene showing all of them standing before Darius in a kind of dignified submission didn't happen. And this is not the representation of an event. It is the representation of the interpreted result of an event. And people of Darius's time were people. They were not stupid. They knew how to look at these images, and they understood what that was. And we should be looking at these with at least the same degree of sophistication as people of Darius's own time. But in spite of that, and in the second place, the text and the images actually do fit together. The narrative of the main text is actually a little bit confusing at first reading because it's not in chronological order. It describes several military campaigns happening in different parts of Iran and Mesopotamia, partially at the same time. And it's not done in chronological order, it's done in geographical order, roughly going clockwise around the Iranian plateau. But if you look at this image, we know when each one of these guys was defeated and where he was defeated. They're arranged in chronological order. So that this relief, although it does not contain an event that is in the narrative, nevertheless contains a narrative property that the text itself doesn't have. And these 2 things, the text and the relief, are knitted together with a kind of sophistication that I think few people would have anticipated when they think about the ancient world. And Darius's contemporaries would have understood that too. The third thing I want to say about this very briefly is that this is the first of the Achaemenid multilingual inscriptions, but it didn't just happen that way. It was the result of several stages of development. It began probably with just a relief, then probably a relief plus an Elamite text, then they add the other 2 versions. Then he adds a little bit to the Persian text and adds this 9th figure here, knocks up part of the Elamite text, so they have to recopy it here. And at the same time, they're expanding the relief in this sort of odd shape to accommodate some more text in there. And we know when it happened. It all happened in a 2-year period. So the point that I'm getting at here is that the Cyrus cylinder was part of a very long Babylonian tradition that was recognized and adopted by Cyrus. This monument, this combination of words and pictures, is the beginning of an entirely new Achaemenid tradition. This is sort of the laboratory in which the Achaemenid royal inscriptions were born. So let me conclude where I started, at Persepolis. This is Darius's foundation inscription at Persepolis. As you can see, it's all inscribed into one great block of stone. You probably can't see the scale of that. That thing is about 23 feet across. It is the biggest single quarried block in the Taht at Persepolis, and just quarrying it was quite an achievement, and getting it there without breaking it was quite an achievement. It's not a multilingual inscription in the ordinary sense. It's actually a combination of 4 different inscriptions with related contents in 3 languages meant to convey purposefully different nuances. So the first 2 texts are written in Old Persian, and they speak of what? They speak of the king, they speak of the land, they speak of the people of Persia, and they say that many lands and peoples are subject to them. Literally, the phrase is to feel fear of them, the Persian, but they, the Persians, are subject to feel fear of no other. So this Persian language of the rulers is being used to make a clear statement about the fact that they are the rulers, they are the dominant. The other 2 texts are in Elamite and Babylonian, and the Elamite text describes the building of Persepolis, called the fortress. They said it was built here where there had been no fortress before. So the Elamite language, the language that is original to the place, is being used to describe Persepolis as part of the place. And the third text, in Babylonian, describes how many people from many lands with many languages, as I said to begin with, took part in the building of Persepolis. So the Babylonian language, the foremost written language of the subject provinces, is making an equally clear statement about the scope of the empire and the place of the subjects in what is intended to be seen as a harmonious work of constructions. Each one of these languages is conveying a message of a slightly different kind, and they are meant to be understood as an ensemble. The king is telling you nowhere in no one of these languages the whole thing. And an ancient observer, if he was literate, would have seen from the physical layout of these texts and understood from their contents that they were all parts of one statement. This is the gate of all nations, as it's called, so called because it describes this Wispazana character of the empire. But in order to have that understanding, the ancient observer would have had to consider all of these languages to be part of the reality and the identity of the center of Darius's empire. I have the next one. Fine. The languages and dialects of the Persians and the Medes, of the rulers of this immense and long-lasting empire, left some marks in the languages of the subject nations in the form of loanwords, and many of those have been transmitted, and we still use some of them today, words like satrap or paradise, for that matter. But Achaemenid rule over this immense area for such a long time never spread the Iranian languages in the way that the Hellenistic kingdom spread the use of Greek, and that Roman rule spread the use of Latin, so that today people in Spain and France speak descendants of Latin, after all. Then as now, in the Achaemenid time as today, language was an important way to represent cultural identity, but for the Achaemenids, it was not the exclusive marker of identity. The identity that these inscriptions represent was, in their word, Wispazana, one of many kinds and many tongues. And thank you for your patience. That's all I will say now. Questions and comments, or would you like to pause and refresh?
I was wondering, how did you learn the pronunciation language? How would you associate the sound to the...
Well, it varies with each of the decipherments, but the basic requirements for the decipherment of the script are, in the first place, having some idea of what the underlying language is, and in the second place, the ideal thing is to have a bilingual. These are trilinguals. So the first step in the decipherment was to get the Old Persian, and by that time, one of the conditions that made the decipherment possible was that people had developed an understanding not only of Iranian and Indo-Iranian languages, but something of their history. So we don't actually know exactly how they pronounced it, but we do know pretty accurately what the phoneme inventory is. So if you were to decipher Roman alphabetic writing of English, you wouldn't know if that vowel was being pronounced by somebody from Oxford or somebody from Texas, but you would know what that vowel is. And if you heard it spoken and you'd learn the Oxford pronunciation of it, you might not have recognized the Texas pronunciation as the same vowel, but when you saw it in writing, you would have known. And the same thing applies, for example, to Akkadian. It's a Semitic language. We can work out the phoneme inventory, so we've got a pretty good idea of roughly how those sounds were realized. Elamite is a much bigger problem because we don't have a cognate, and there's a lot of argument still to be done about what the phonology of Elamite is, and so our pronunciation of it is, for the most part, conventional. We're using the Akkadian values of the writing system to represent it, but because we have these texts and the text from Persepolis, we can see also how they transcribe Persian and other Iranian dialects into Elamite. So that tells us not only something about Persian dialects and Iranian dialects, but it tells us something about the actual phonology of the Elamite, how they employed the writing system to employ their pronunciation. I'm afraid it's a complicated answer, but it would be like trying to figure out from written French how you pronounce French, or from written Danish how you pronounce Danish. You can read it, and then when you hear it, my God, they just got here from Mars. When you hear French, you wonder, how did those Gauls do that to Latin? Yes?
Most people interested in ancient Iranian history, their sources are the Greek sources, the Bible, and some translations of the Old Persian texts. And here we all have a unique opportunity to hear from you about the element and what information there is that most people who are otherwise knowledgeable about ancient Persia would not have. You couldn't summarize. I realize it's not second nature to you, so it's hard to ask you.
It's far from second nature, and I find it extremely difficult to summarize because it's an interesting answer, a question with a complex answer, part of which I will try to address later. But part of it is also what I began with here. The old Persian royal inscriptions are the statements of kings, and they tell you how you want them to understand them. And one of the nice things, I suppose, about the Persian Empire is that they like to portray themselves as being balanced and unwarlike for the purpose of a historian. It's quite unfortunate because the atrocious Assyrians who delight in military campaigns and atrocities tell you a lot about what they did and where they went and how they did it. And they describe their empire as the result of constant struggle. The Persian kings, after the BC Tun inscription, tell you almost nothing about what they did and how they did it. They treat the empire as a fact of the universe. Darius begins each one by saying, "These are the lands that became mine when I became king. Ahura Mazda made them mine." They didn't have to be won. They didn't have to be conquered. The empire in his portrayal was not a work, not an accomplishment of human beings. It was a fact of existence. And if other people didn't see it that way, well, he wasn't going to write that down. So we don't know very much about the internal workings from the words of the kings themselves. As I once said, they were men of few words. If you put all their words together, there's only about 400 different ones in all of the royal inscriptions if you don't count the proper names. So we have to look for other sources. But very few of the other sources have narratives. They're also not about the deeds of kings. They're about the people who are making this stuff work. So you're still not getting the kind of narrative that the Greek and Roman sources, and for that matter, the movies and paintings that Western art and literature and recent film, for that matter, like to portray about the exotic Persian Empire. What you're getting is the actual day-to-day behaviors of men and women interacting in a kind of complex institutional environment. I was just reading something earlier today about a review of a book about early modern English history. And it quoted this famous line about historians being the arbiters of the enormous condescension of posterity. Very nice phrase, by which he meant that historians get to choose who was important, who gets remembered, and who gets forgotten. Well, that may be true of people working with more or less modern sources, but people working with ancient sources have to make everything out of what they can find. They have to get everything they can out of it. And one of the oddities is that we are not allowed that kind of condescension, so that we know a lot more about some people who lived in the empire of Cyrus than we know about Cyrus. Because they don't tell us about him, and he didn't tell us much about him either. What we have is what the Greeks and Romans said about him, which is partially reliable and partially not so reliable. I am among those who thinks that having your enemies write your history is not an altogether bad thing, because their distortions are easier to deal with than our own self-conception and our own self-deception. So, for example, if you read about modern American politics in the European press and compare it to what you read in the American press, you might be thinking about two different countries and trying to make that comparison and then say, what do you do with that when you look at ancient sources? It's an interesting exercise that I recommend to everybody. Yes.
An unrelated question. An unrelated question. May I ask what was the source of the first map that you showed? Is it a new one or it's an old map that you showed?
The map of the whole Persian Empire.
Yes.
No, that's the map that's reproduced. That was drawn for the publication of the Persepolis excavations. It's in the Oriental Institute publications, the big three-volume publication of the Oriental Institute.
Yeah, no, the one that you just passed.
Yeah, but I know the one you mean. It's in one of the 3 volumes, possibly 2 of the 3 volumes of the Oriental Institute's publication of the Persepolis excavations.
Yeah, but now I am only surprised that it says Arabian Gulf.
I mean, it says, I'm sorry.
It says Arabian Gulf, not Persian.
Oh, this
Gulf.
one. Which, this one? Oh, no, that's not, I don't remember where this one
And I am
comes from.
surprised because you are talking about Persian history.
No, I didn't even
and
notice
all
that.
this stuff.
This is a modern map, and it doesn't have anything historical on it. So I got this mostly to get the relief. I don't remember where this one comes from.
I mean, especially in your presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's a lapse of courtesy, and I beg your pardon. And while I understand why people who publish maps of this kind are sometimes obliged to call it the Arabian Gulf, as far as I know, the English name of this body of water has for a long time been the Persian Gulf. One of these days, when our history is being written in China, the oceans will have different names. We can go on about this, about the name of the Black Sea and the Greek name of the Black Sea, which actually is a misunderstanding of the Persian name of the Black Sea. These things get handed down in interesting ways, but I'm sorry, this was a simple lapse of courtesy for which I meant no offense. I understand. This is a specific political statement by whoever made this map, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the source of it. I thought it was a nice relief map of the area that I was concerned with. Yes? Yes.
How accurate was the translation, for example, from the Old Persian to the Elamite and then to the Babylonian, right?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. That's a totally fascinating question. I'm sorry to say that I could get extremely long-winded about it. The question is, how accurate, in the trilingual inscriptions, how accurate is the translation, the correspondence among the versions? And I said correspondence advisedly because it's not always a matter of translation. Generally speaking, the best example is actually the Bisitun inscription because it's the longest and most diverse and most interesting of the inscriptions. Generally speaking, you can break it down into 2 slightly different editions. And when there are differences among the versions, most of the time, the Persian and the Elamite agree closely and the Babylonian departs. And sometimes the Babylonian departs in its actual content. It will say things that the other versions didn't say, and it will say things that seem to be meant particularly for Babylonian and perhaps for farther Western ears. So in a certain sense, there are 2 versions. The one is the sort of Iranian internal version, that's the Elamite and the Persian, and the other is the sort of imperial, the Western version, that's the Babylonian, and where you have it, the Aramaic always agrees closely with the Babylonian. So it has some interesting properties to it. For example, when he's describing the defeats of his adversaries, the Babylonian adds the numbers of captives and killed. The Persian and the Elamite don't have those. And there are some other things of that kind. But it's not completely true. There are places where the Elamite agrees with the Babylonian against the Persian. Why is this? Well, the reason is the order in which the inscriptions were put up that I mentioned to you. Because the very first version, we're almost certain, was in Elamite. The underlying text might have been composed and dictated in Persian, and certainly the Elamite looks as if it's representing an underlying Persian text. But it goes up in Elamite first. And then the Babylonian goes up, and it has all of these differences, and then the Persian goes up, and then there's the new Elamite version. And the Persian one sometimes has some departures from the Elamite that suggest that there's some final editorial touches being done in the Elamite version. Well, that's a matter of editorial comparison, and you're asking partly about translation. One of the reasons I say this is it's not exactly a matter of one-to-one translation at every point. But there are places where they can't translate. So there are places where the Elamite, for example, instead of translating a Persian word, simply transcribes it into Elamite signs, same word. And the Babylonian will have an approximate translation of it. There are one or two places, in fact, where it's even a sort of a literal expression. It's toward the end it says, if you say to yourself, may my kingdom endure, then, you know, bless me and do this. And that's actually transcribed in the Elamite, but the Elamite transcription of it gives you a slightly different form from the Persian. So it means that in the first draft of it, the Persian was written using one verb form, and in the later draft, the Persian changed the verb form. So we actually get a lot of dynamic interplay, both translational and editorial, among the versions of these, and to a lesser extent, that's true in some of the shorter inscriptions also.
Dr. Stolper, as the leading scholar in deciphering the Elamite language, I'm wondering if it would be possible to rewind to one of the slides where we can actually see the tablet and see you read one of the tablets. I think that would be fascinating.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I have so much trouble with this. Let me see if
Sorry
I can...
to put you on the spot.
Oh, you did. Let's see what this one is. Yeah, well, it begins with a number here that's broken, and the number ends with 1, and that's a half. That doesn't take much, right? There's a 1, there's a half. But then that's the sign for grain, barley, she, bar, mesh. This is the same thing that you would find in Babylonian and Syrian. This is one of the wonderful things about the cuneiform script. Sometimes we know what it means without knowing what it says. So it's so and so much barley, and then here it says this word kurnin, it means literally by the hand of. It's designating the agent who's handing out this material, and then this mentions a proper name, and this is the guy's name, which is received, and then it's giving the descriptions of the people who are going to get this stuff. It says so and so many workers, du man ba, they are supposed to be receiving, and then the rest of it is a list here of how many people get how much ration, right? So 3 ditto, and the ditto here is boys, and then you get down here 1 ditto gets so and so much, and then you get down here to women. 1 woman gets 5, that is 5 of these units, 5 bar of grain. 34 women get 4, etc. 9 women get 2, and then it goes on down here. So it's as banal a record as you could possibly ask for. There is so and so much barley being handed out as monthly rations to a work group. There will be a total here, which you can't read, that says how many it is altogether. They don't even have names. Right? The immense condescension of posterity that I referred to, it begins here. On the other hand, we're actually seeing, first of all, how much they got, what the range of how much they got was, and who got it to them. So that's what it is.
I was wondering, what time span do these descriptions cover when you have studied them? How far in time have you seen it?
Which the Achaemenid Persian royal inscriptions.
Yeah.
The oldest one, of course, is the Cyrus cylinder, and then the trilingual inscriptions begin with Darius. We have nothing at all from Cambyses. So Bisitun is really the first one, around 520 BC. The last ones come from the reign of Artaxerxes III, so about a generation before Alexander, and then nothing after that. And the last ones are pretty thin on the ground. The overwhelming majority of the royal inscriptions of the Achaemenid Persian kings that we have come from Darius I and Xerxes, and a rather small scattering after that. The administrative tablets, the overwhelming, this one great archive, all comes from a span of less than 20 years in the reign of Darius, but there's a second smaller archive that comes from the end of the reign of Darius, the entire reign of Xerxes, the beginning of the reign of Artaxerxes, and then we have 1 or 2 other scattered ones. many people, workers, members of the court, travelers, and so on, but not all of the consumers are human. Some of these supplies are being handed out for religious observances, religious feasts, for consumption by or before gods. So Ahura Mazda, but also some other gods. So you get a little bit of the kind of information that you do not get from the Gathas about the local practice of a religion. The other kind of information you get is iconographic, that is, all of the seal impressions. As you'll see later, there are the impressions of seals on these tablets, and among the things that they represent are sometimes religious behaviors, processions, people standing before altars. So the actual visualization of religious ceremonial practice of a kind that we don't get described in any written source. And then on top of that, of course, there's a lot of the kind of iconography that you also find in monumental art, which is really representing the visualization of the supernatural world, the representation of mythical beasts as representatives of chaos being combating order. So we see how they reduced some of the invisible to visibility in much the same way that European art, for example, portrays angels. So you actually get quite a lot, and it's, again, a lot of highly specific information that isn't kind of systematized in the way people like religious doctrine to be systematized. As you know from your own lives, the relationship between religious doctrine and religious practice and the practice of daily life is often rather complex and sometimes contradictory, and I don't think that it was any different in ancient times.
Probably you talk about it in your next presentation, but how many of these tablets are actually in the United States? How many?
Let me preface that by saying that the three most frequent questions I'm asked about the Persepolis fortification tablets are, in order of frequency, how many are there? How much are they worth? And then the third question is a very, very, very distant third. What are they about and what are they good for? How many are there is actually a kind of complicated question. The original excavator said that there were probably about 30,000 tablets and fragments, plus lots and lots and lots of small pieces. And I wrote a kind of complicated article to try to figure out how many original documents are represented by what we have. And I would say that the number of original documents represented by these intact tablets and the fragments is probably in that general range, somewhere around 20 to 25,000. The trouble is that that's not in itself a statement that I think is meaningful. And as I will say later on, there are tens of thousands of pieces, but they are all pieces of one thing. I cannot stress this often enough. Each one of these tablets carries a certain information load of a fairly complicated kind that would be interesting to nerds like me who like to do this stuff, even if we only had them one at a time. But the overwhelming majority of their value for language, for art, for religion, for history, for institution, comes from the connections among them. If you are running a high-energy physics experiment and you have one collision in the cloud chamber or the bubble chamber, it's meaningless. You need a million collisions for it to start to mean things. So it all has to fit together. If you dig up one bone of a dinosaur, you don't have a dinosaur. If you dig up a complete skeleton and put it on exhibit in a museum, and I'm going to show you the picture of it later on, you don't say, gee, I wonder how many bones they found. And why are all those bones different shapes? How did they know that the head went on that end and the tail went on that end? Well, when you put it together, it's not a question you ask. That's what we have. We have tens of thousands of pieces of one thing. And that's what's at risk in the lawsuit, because the lawsuit really threatens not only the future of the tablets, but the future of what makes the tablets, what transforms the tablets from mere data into meaning. So the answer is one. And it's the only one there is, by the way. Yes, sir.
Can you explain, if you've thought to that question, why Aramaic is absent from most of these inscriptions?
Well, yes. First of all, it really wasn't Darius that made it the lingua franca. It had been spreading in that use, both for local practical recording and for interregional communication already in the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires, and we have a lot of evidence of that. What the Persian Empire did, what Darius did, was spread it over a much, much, much larger range, so that it goes all the way down into Egypt and all the way up into Anatolia and all the way into Central Asia. But why it's absent from these inscriptions, I don't really know. My first thought is to say, well, this is something that you really only use for specific purposes, and each of these languages has a specific overtone, a specific nuance. But that doesn't really wash, because in Western Anatolia, we have a trilingual inscription, not of a king, but from a temple precinct in Lydia, that is done probably at the behest of a satrap. It certainly mentions the local satrap, and it's trilingual. It's in Greek, Lydian, and Aramaic. So they're perfectly capable of using Aramaic in this monumental use, but it's not done in the heartland. It has, I think, partly at least to do with the political and cultural identity of, if they had such a conception of the core and the periphery. Because when you see in the Bisitun inscription, when you see him referring to the lands of the empire, he will say Persia, Media, and the lands. And in the Babylonian says Persia, Media, Babylonia, and the lands. So when it comes to, and the lands is every place else. Right? So what comes to the actual identity of the core of the empire, for at least part of that expression, Mesopotamia is included, but points farther west, for which Aramaic would be the first language, aren't. So perhaps it has to do with a somewhat, what should I say, a level of political identity that I can only really speculate about, that I don't think we can really, really grasp confidently. But this is a hint in that direction. Yes, ma'am? What are they worth? Well, I answer it in two ways. One is to say, when it comes to ancient tablets, I have the same relation to these things the police have to marijuana. I get it for free. It just comes up out of the ground. And then I also say, well, these are just pieces of mud that somebody poked with a stick a long time. How much is that worth to you? But I'm not naive. I know what things command in the antiquities market. And I don't even want to speculate. It's actually a kind of interesting problem, because you actually could come up with a couple of comparanda, the way you do in selling real estate. Say, here's a comparable property that's sold for thus and such a date. And then you decide what to multiply it by. Well, then you've got a problem, right? Because a lot of the value of these things is their scarcity value. A few of these things have been sold, not the excavated ones, but things that sort of leaked out of the excavation and found their way onto the market. So we have a rough idea of prices. But part of the price they commanded was their scarcity value. So if suddenly there are 5 or 10 or 20 or 30,000 of them, the unit price is going to go down. And whoever is going to try to turn that into money has to do a little two-variant equation to say, what is the optimum price I can realize by controlling the flow of this? But look at what the consequence is. This is a problem that has been solved by farmers in Turkey and Iraq 100 years ago. They know how to keep prices up by keeping supply down. But what it means is, if you keep the supply down, you have to make the stuff inaccessible. And therefore, the more it's worth, the less its scholarly and intellectual value becomes, because it no longer becomes information. It becomes objects that you're trying to transform into money. And that's one of the great dangers here.
I know there are a lot of questions, but in order to stay with the time frame, let's take a break and reconvene at 5:45. And if anybody has any further questions, Dr. Stolper will be here the rest of the evening, and I'm sure you can have direct conversations with him. Thank you. So a brief break until 5:45.
Thank you again for your attention.